For this early members release, I think what I'm going to do is touch on statements and questions and thoughts regarding cosmic horror or Lovecraftian influences on my work, and explain why, broadly, I think, though obviously Lovecraft has had a very deep influence on my work and was maybe the first truly great horror author I really dug into and explored the entire catalog of, I don't really consider the vast majority of my work to fall into the category of cosmic horror or Lovecraftian horror. That means this talk may well really only be of use or of interest to people that are either writers themselves or take an interest in literary or philosophical processes, thought processes behind writing. So feel free to give it a skip if that's not your thing. Now, I think it's worth specifying before I get into this that nothing that I'm about to say is an attack on Lovecraft, obviously. As I said earlier, I would rank him as maybe America's greatest practitioner of horror. There are people who I think carry certain elements of it better. Maybe Poe had better prose if you're going to look at it from a purely poetic sense. But the sheer unbridled imagination of Lovecraft, especially considering the time in which he was living, the unprecedented nature of a lot of what he was writing, especially his poetry, really is unmatched. I don't think you can take any one person within this field, especially in the American tradition, and compare them to him. He is the peak. So nothing that I'm saying is an assault on Lovecraft or, a disavowal of Lovecraft in any way. But the philosophy of Lovecraft was very different than mine. He had a lot of beliefs about civilization and hierarchy that I do not share. And I think while the aesthetics, the kind of visual elements and thematic elements of Lovecraft have definitely bled over into my work, if I attempted to recreate his work on a philosophical level, those differences would kind of prevent me from doing it effectively. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So, when I hear Lovecraftian, I think cosmic horror. Now, I suppose it could be argued that Lovecraftian could just mean, it involves extra-dimensional creatures, or tentacles, or, gods that have been forgotten, esoteric religions, etc. You could argue that it's just a thematic thing. But when I hear Lovecraftian, I think cosmic horror. That was his origination, if we're going to... I suppose I wouldn't say it was his origination. There are definitely people like Machen, I guess, and others in that line that I feel like it kind of had touched on things like this before, but Lovecraft was maybe the first to give shape to that as a life's work. His whole portfolio, for the most part, with a couple notable exceptions, fits the bill of cosmic horror. And the way cosmic horror is typically going to be classified is the horror of cosmic horror on a philosophical, broad, literary level is not just rooted in the fact that the things happening are spooky, but in the fact that humanity and the Earth's insignificance is kind of driven home by the cosmic horror, right? In a good Lovecraft story, so far as Lovecraft critics like Joshi or any others that are, I'd just say his name because he's maybe the most prolific that I'm aware of. When the literatus focusing on Lovecraft breaks down a Lovecraft story, they will typically cite this smallness of humankind, the insignificance and powerlessness of humankind, as being core to what makes Lovecraft and cosmic horror so unique. This is what makes it potent. And I would agree that one of the reasons that fiction carries so much weight is precisely because Lovecraft, philosophically, was a hyper-materialist and carried a little bit of nihilism in him, and lived during a time period where the universe, so far as human perception was concerned, was expanding more and more, and new discoveries were being made year after year. And, he could, as an amateur, enthusiast of science, look on from his own telescope out a window and, see the scale of discoveries being made in journals. And to him, this was an obvious state of mind to have. He was, as I say, a very, in his mind, grounded, materialist, atheist, rational thinker. So to him, the idea of this random, uncaring, icy universe was real. It was literal. So it then enabled him to write this horror, which is very, again, icy, distant, clinical. I think some of it even comes through in his prose, which, again, even though I may laud the prose of like an Edgar Allan Poe above his own, Lovecraft's prose is great in the sense that a lot of what he presents, it feels almost like you're reading it in an academic journal. There are elements of this are very obvious. For example, if we're going to take at the Mountains of Madness, the descriptions of the elder things, the way in which the bas-reliefs in the ruins are described, almost the entirety of At the Mountains of Madness feels very genuine, despite its sometimes very florid literary descriptions, because a lot of the flow of it feels almost like you're reading an article about something, rather than you're reading, an author's fictional presentation of something. So in a way, this affected not just the things he wrote about and the kinds of stories he told, this cosmic horror he developed, but the way he told them, and that's part of why they're so effective. But as I've said, I don't really share a lot of Lovecraft's philosophies. I process information and view the world around me, and humanity's place in it, and by extension the universe, very differently than he did. Frankly, I think while I would obviously, in a theoretical scenario, I would love the chance to kind of pick Lovecraft's brain or have a conversation with him, to have lived during that time period and have corresponded with him, etc. The correspondence of his that I've read, and I own a great deal of it and have read a great deal of it, it makes me feel as if I would have a very difficult time getting along with this man. He's very much the antithesis to me. Any time in this collection of correspondence that I own of his that he is in conversation with another person in a, usually politely argumentative tone, I am almost always on the side of the other person in whatever argument is occurring. The best example of this is his letters to or with Robert E. Howard. If you're going to embody the mood of some of those arguments in the most elemental terms, I think, Lovecraft is a Roman man. He believes in progress and rationalism and comfort, home. He believes effectively in, humanity's overriding or most noble goal being advancement. Whereas Robert E. Howard is a Gallic man. He's a Visigothic man, even a Hunnic man. He's a barbarian. The way he views the world is principally through a lens of freedom. So the Teuton might live a less comfortable or advanced or prolific in material terms life than a Roman, say, but he has more agency in the civilization that he lives in. He has more say. He has more freedom to go and do what he pleases. And this freedom, this individual power, is what is most important to him. Robert E. Howard was the original return to monkey Uncle Ted respecter, in a way. A lot of his fiction kind of revolves around the idea that civilization is innately an unnatural state of man, and that man is always ever destined by his own kind of desires for wild liberty to return to a state of barbarism or nomadic life or hunter-gatherer pursuits, however you'd like to classify this. So that's maybe the most classic example of a an HP versus RE argument. And I'm always on the Robert E. Howard side of those arguments. So I think what this says about Robert E. Howard, and to an extent me as well, is that even if Robert E. Howard was not very devoutly religious, not religious at all so far as I can tell, and though I am fairly unconvinced in religious terms for any one given faith or denomination, etc., we both hold a belief that there's something indelible and unique and transcendent about the human experience, the human spirit or soul, if you wanted to put it in those terms, that is important, that's vital, that defies material explanation. Not in a magical, mystical kind of way necessarily, though maybe it could hold those connotations, but more in a philosophical sense, in an almost Nietzschean sense, in a grasping sense, the drive of mankind to explore, to win glory, to create great works of art. I feel like to a philosophy like Howard's, or to a philosophy like mine, in itself, reason enough to believe that humanity, Earth, etc., our place in the universe, is special, that it is transcendent, that it holds great value. You know, in my mind, and obviously I'm not in even a civilizational majority in this, because we live in a very material, nihilistic age, but in my mind, it's hard to interface with the works of, say, a Dostoevsky, or the very dark, gnarled reaches of inner Appalachia, or if we're going to use somewhere that's less personal to me, a place like the Caucasus Mountains, or any of these places that fire my imagination, and have fired human imaginations for a very, 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 very long time, likely before we were human beings in an evolutionary sense. If you've seen the scale of the world you inhabit and experienced the profundity of the creativity of man, the mind of man, in a non-intellectual sense, in a non-scientific sense, in a purely artistic, creative, imaginative sense, if you've experienced that level of imagination and in turn had your imagination fired by the experience of the world around you, I find it very difficult to maintain that kind of very clinical, icy, detached, material, nihilistic view of the world. So as such, as much as I love Lovecraft, I can't write a Lovecraftian story to save my life. In fact, that's one of the biggest reasons why my attempt at a Lovecraft fragment adaptation last Halloween failed, was because in that one instance, I was going to attempt to kind of very strictly hold to this philosophical underpinning to the story that was very bleak and cosmic in nature, a real cosmic horror story, and couldn't do it. Not convincingly, anyway. So it's safe to say that, much as I respect the man, I don't necessarily share his worldview, his paradigm, so my stories tend to take a bit of a different turn. There are a lot of my stories, if taken in isolation, that I think could be taken to be cosmic horror, and it would be fair to consider them as such if they were not part of a broader kind of mythos or cycle of stories or interconnected universe. A good example of this would be Dreamer in the Gorge or Forest Through the Trees. If you take those stories in isolation, they feel very Lovecraft in mood. Maybe not necessarily in prose, because I can't necessarily nail that down, but in mood, they feel that way. But then, if you take a look at all of the collected works in the Awakening cycle of stories, and especially the Awakening novel, they don't hold up to the title of cosmic horror, of being titled cosmic horror. The whole narrative thrust of Awakening is that Luther, this, sort of urbane or suburbane, if we're going to fabricate a word, I think, here, this urbane / suburbane dork sallies forth with this band of weirdos and outcasts and misfits, but capable weirdos and outcasts, and finds that he is not only capable of surviving in an environment incredibly alien and hostile to everything that he's experienced in his life thus far, but he's also capable of being a hero that slays what to human beings by scale might as well be a god. It's a transcendent, victorious story. Obviously, there's a lot of horror elements in it, and I would still classify it as a horror novel, but realistically, when looked at not just as a novel, but as an arc of stories, these stories have an overarching message of hope for mankind, not because of any intervention from a religious source, but simply because human beings are kick-ass. They're capable of very glorious and transcendent and immortal things, deeds. So through their deeds, they are capable of doing great things in these works. And I think that's not totally alien to Lovecraft. My favorite Lovecraft story of all time is the Dunwich Horror, and this is kind of the reverse of my work, where, if you take my work in isolation, maybe it can be cosmic horror. If you take the Dunwich Horror in isolation, despite the fact that in broad scope it still fits cosmic horror, if you take it on its own, it is a very victorious, triumphant, glorious story, despite the horror elements involved in it. At the end of the day, the based cabal of early 1900s adventurous academics that set forth to Dunwich to slay an extra-dimensional mutt, if we're going to call it that, succeed. They do the job. They close the gate, so they save the day. They save maybe Earth. So even Lovecraft, had his moments where he shifted this philosophical net for the purpose of a narrative. So, as I say, certainly if you take Forest Through the Trees on its own, you might say, oh yeah, that's very cosmic in scope. That's very bleak. It's very hopeless. But taken as a whole, most of my work tends to be much more transcendent and aspiring in a, human sense than Lovecraft's does. Which, as I say, have said many times, isn't to demean his work. It's just to say that his goals in writing are different than mine. His literary beliefs and the things that are being reflected in his writing are different than mine. And even if we set aside cosmic horror and look at things purely in thematic terms, there are a lot of methods, themes, aesthetics in my work that are not, or could even be considered anti-Lovecraft. A great example of this would be the treatment of disparate rural populations. If Lovecraft writes a story and rustics or the backwoods or the rural reaches of a given county or state are mentioned, it's generally going to be that place that is the source of danger. Whether it's Innsmouth or Dunwich or the squatter settlements in the Lurking Fear, it's almost universal to a Lovecraft story that when you go into the bayou outside New Orleans, the people there are going to be kind of maybe frightened idiots, but simultaneously some among them, the most degenerate in Lovecraft's kind of phrasing of them, will be kind of the root of the problem. It's a rural wizard that is summoning dark forces in the Dunwich Horror. It is backwards coastal townspeople, townies that are interbreeding with fish people in Innsmouth, and bringing about weird, draconian, wicked changes in the populace, etc. So typically, Lovecraft has a very, urbane, son of Providence mindset, and there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. I think in his time especially, being urbane, was not nearly so cancerous as it is today. So I can kind of respect that, even if I would still prefer, even if born in his time period, to have been a rustic. But all in all, if you read a story of mine, though a lot of them will occur in a rustic setting, the threat or danger is almost always coming from outside the rustic setting. It is an outsider that brings it into the setting. The trouble doesn't come from in town among who you know, at least not big trouble like that. Rather, it comes from meddlers from outside. So there are little thematic differences like that I think are rife in the work. So they're different, I would say. He's definitely my favorite author in the field, and I reread his work on a regular basis, and I hold him aloft as, the greatest of practitioners of this craft, in this genre at least. But yet I think thematically, especially in terms of cosmic horror, my work falls short of being classifiable as cosmic horror. So as much as I recognize the similarities, I think I'm kind of doing my own thing. Not to say it hasn't been done before. Obviously it has, but Howard's horror typically kind of fits this bill. So in a way, I would say my horror is more Howardian than it is Lovecraftian.